Chapter 12. Has man a soul? It has thus far been provisionally assumed that man has a soul. But before proceeding to formulate a scientific argument demonstrative of the soul's immortality, it is logically necessary to demonstrate the verity of the provisional assumption. Materialistic science will certainly be satisfied with nothing less, for it is at this point that it invariably calls a halt and reminds us that the primary rule of logic demands that our premises be not assumed. In discussing this branch of the subject in a work like this, the reader must be presumed to be somewhat familiar with the current literature relating to the psychic phenomena of the 19th century, especially with that which deals with the scientific aspects of the various questions involved. It is obviously impossible, within the limits of a single volume, to present documentary evidence of the verity of every statement that must be made. Therefore, results only can be stated, but the reader may rest assured that I shall not attempt to lead him outside the realm of scientifically verified facts, which can be experimentally reproduced. Should I attempt to do so, the fraud would be easily detected, for the facts are public property and are known to him who reads. My conclusions from those facts, however, rest upon a different footing. They are necessarily my own, and it is the province of the reader to test their soundness in the crucible of his own logic, if mine is found to be unsound or unsatisfactory. That man has a soul is and has been, since the dawn of civilization, a matter of intuitive perception. That is to say, all civilized people have felt that they realized, in a more or less definite way, that there is in man what appears to be a distinct entity which is apparently capable of sustaining an existence independently of the body. This fact of universality of perception constitutes a strong argument, though not a conclusive one, in support of that doctrine and its corollary, a future life. It is noteworthy that in the early history of the world, the higher the state of civilization, the more pronounced and definite were the current notions regarding the soul's existence. Although they lacked that clearness and simplicity which characterized the purely intuitional perceptions of those who were less skilled in philosophical ratiocination. Thus, in Greece, the doctrine was formulated in clear and definite terms by Plato, who held that man is composed of body, soul, and spirit. His doctrine, however, was the result of something more than intuition. He does not tell us the distinction between soul and spirit, and leaves us entirely in the dark as to whether his conclusions were arrived at from the observation of phenomena, or from purely speculative philosophy, without facts to sustain it. But it must be remembered that Plato, in common with the other philosophers of his day, regarded the conclusions derived from purely speculative philosophy as good as so many facts for the purpose of constructing the major premise of a syllogism. Not that they disdained facts, or failed to employ them when they were easily obtainable, but that they failed to estimate the relative value of a demonstrated fact and the conclusions resulting from their own speculations. Again, Plato may have been influenced by the Hindu philosophy, which constructs man in sections, puts him together like a telescope, and assigns him the task of shedding one section at a time until there is nothing left but pure spirit. It seems probable, however, that Plato's idea of man may have arisen from a malobservation of psychic phenomena. Thus, his idea of the spirit may have been derived from his observation of the operation of the subjective faculties, and his idea of the soul from his observation of the objective mental activity, or vice versa. In other words, he failed to observe that the objective mind, instead of being an entity, is merely the function of the human brain and necessarily ceases with the death of the body, whereas the subjective mind belongs to a distinct entity which is apparently capable of sustaining an existence independently of the body. It is this entity which modern philosophers denominate the soul or the spirit, the two terms, in the vocabulary of modern spiritual philosophy, being generally synonymous. It is true that there are still to be found occasional representatives of the telescopic school of spiritual philosophy who hold to the old doctrine of three entities, body, soul, and spirit. But no one of them has ever been able to point to a single fact which discloses the existence of more than two. There are others who cling to the old vocabulary, but admit that there are but two entities, namely, the body and the soul, the spirit, in their philosophy, being the life principle which animates both body and soul, as well as all organic nature. In this sense, there is no objection to the phrase, save that it has a tendency to confuse the unscientific mind and to lead it into a maze of speculation which is as unprofitable as it is unscientific. This apparent digression is made for the purpose of placing the conclusions derived from the speculative philosophy of the ancients in sharp contrast with the intuitional perceptions of the unperverted human soul, especially that of Jesus of Nazareth. I shall now follow it up by showing that the facts developed by modern scientific investigation confirm and emphasize the philosophy of Jesus in all its purity and simplicity. For it is a fact of most profound significance that Jesus, although he must be presumed to have been acquainted with all the philosophy of his day, never gave utterance to a word which indicated his belief in that complicated spiritual structure of man which has been so industriously proclaimed by both ancient and modern philosophers. He taught the simple truth that man has a soul. He demonstrated that truth by the production of phenomena of the soul. He promulgated the doctrine that the soul is capable of sustaining an existence independently of the body. And he taught mankind how to deserve and how to attain immortal life. This comprises all that man needs to know of spiritual philosophy, and it will not be denied that in its simplicity of statement it bears the impress of scientific truth. It is the province of science to ascertain whether observable facts confirm his doctrines. Should a scientist who is unfamiliar with the recent developments of psychic science be asked what would constitute conclusive evidence to his mind of the existence of a soul in man, he would doubtless reply that he must first be convinced that the mind does not follow the conditions of the body and brain. Then he would launch out into a more or less learned dissertation, reminding us that all human experience goes to show that as the body grows weaker, the mind grows weaker, that a disease of the brain produces insanity or imbecility, that certain organs of the mind can be modified, inhibited, or totally destroyed by a surgical operation, that mechanical pressure upon the brain produces total unconsciousness and insensibility, that when the body dies, all manifestations of mind cease at once and forever, etc. In short, he would lead us through all the stock arguments of materialistic science which go to prove that the mind is not an entity, but a function of the physical brain, and that it necessarily ceases to manifest itself when the brain loses its vitality. All this we have heard before, ad nauseam, and all this we admit to be true, so far as the objective mind is concerned, but we hasten to remind him that the researches of modern science have developed the fact that man has a dual mind, two planes of consciousness, a normal and a supernormal plane, and that the latter manifests itself when the former is inhibited. In other words, when the brain is asleep and all the objective senses or faculties are in complete abeyance, the supernormal or subjective faculties are capable of intense activity. If he has heard of hypnotism as developed by orthodox scientists, he is ready to admit that man has a dual mind in the sense that it acts in one way under certain conditions of the body, and in another way under certain other conditions of the body. It is the same mind, he adds, its powers and functions being susceptible to modification either by peripheral stimuli or by the inhibition of activity in certain nerve centers and the stimulation of others to abnormal activity. All this has a very learned sound, in that it is characterized by the oracular indefiniteness of true materialistic science when dealing with problems beyond its legitimate domain. Should we then remind him that the facts of experimental psychology show that duality of mind means vastly more than is implied in his definition, that, in fact, it is demonstrable that man possesses a dual mind? He would doubtless inform us at once that such a thing is impossible, that it is contrary to the nature of things, that it is subversive of all psychological science with which he is acquainted, and, worst of all, it would destroy the value and significance of all the learning that has been bestowed in times past upon the science of psychology. In short, that all the vast bibliography of the old psychology would have to be revised and rewritten, if the dual mind theory is demonstrable. Of course, all this is very shocking and subversive and revolutionary, and all that, but we will suppose our scientist to be a fair-minded man, and we will venture one more question, namely, what demonstration, short of pulling the two minds out of a man with a pair of forceps, weighing them in a balance, and carving them with a scalpel, would be considered adequate proof of the actual existence of two minds in man? I submit that the conditions to be prescribed by the most exacting scientist could be no more severe than the following. 1. It must be shown that man possesses attributes and powers independent of each other and irreconcilable with each other except by the hypothesis that he is endowed with two minds. 2. That each is capable of independent action while the other is in complete abeyance. 3. That each must possess powers and limitations not possessed by the other. 4. That each must, in the normal man, perform functions which the other is incapable of exercising. 5. That one mind must normally be subordinate to the other. 6. That there must be some evidence of the survival of one after the extinction of the other. 7. That each of the foregoing propositions must be demonstrated by an appeal to observable facts that are susceptible of no other rational interpretation. I think it will be conceded by the most skeptical that if the foregoing propositions can be fairly established, it will constitute at least prima facie evidence of the existence of a soul in mankind. When this is done, it will be followed by other considerations which will be demonstrative of that proposition. In the meantime, as the above propositions are nearly related, they will be considered together. The broad line of distinction and demarcation between the two classes of attributes consists in the fact, which is of everyday observation and universal experience, that normally each class of attributes manifests itself while the other is quiescent. This fact is brought to universal consciousness in the phenomena of dreams. If dreams had but recently been brought to the attention of the civilized world, they would now be considered the most wonderful phenomena of the human mind. Being the common experience of all mankind, their real significance has been to a great extent overlooked. The reason for this is found in the fact that their most common form of manifestation can be traced either to peripheral stimuli or to the uppermost waking thoughts of the sleeper. But it occasionally happens, and has happened throughout all the ages of which history or tradition gives us any account, that men have dreamed dreams which cannot be traced to anything within the known physical or mental environment of the dreamer. Dreams which give warning of impending danger, dreams which demonstrate the fact of communion with friends at a distance, dreams which solve problems far beyond the objective or normal capacity of the dreamer, are among the phenomena which point clearly to a consciousness distinct from and independent of his normal consciousness, and possessing a power of perception of truth which reaches out far beyond the range of the objective senses. These are phenomena which have been observed in a haphazard, unintelligent way throughout all the ages, and would doubtless have continued to be so observed had not the phenomena of mesmerism or hypnotism been brought to the attention of science. Hypnotism enables us to study the phenomena of dreams by experimental reproduction, and in this sense it may be defined to be the power to reproduce the phenomena of dreams. It is that, but it is more. It is the power, not only to reproduce, but to control the phenomena, and carry them to an intelligible conclusion. Hypnotic phenomena possess all the salient characteristics of dream phenomena, and are governed by the same laws, modified only by methods of induction. The total or partial abeyance of the objective senses, sleep, is the first requisite in each ease. In hypnotism, the subject is en rapport with the hypnotist, and his dreams are controlled by the suggestions of the latter. In natural sleep, the subject is en rapport with himself, and his dreams are controlled sometimes by the suggestions conveyed in the current of his waking thoughts, and sometimes by those of peripheral stimuli. This is practically all that differentiates hypnotic sleep from natural sleep. Bernheim. When the sleep is induced by hypnotic processes, the subject may always be made to dream by making oral suggestions, and frequently by mere mental suggestion. He can also be made to dream by peripheral stimuli, such as applying heat or cold to his body, or by placing him in attitudes suggestive of certain mental emotions, or by causing music to be played in his presence. There is another point where the phenomena of hypnotism and dreams exactly coincide which deserves particular attention. It is well known that, when sleep is profound, dreams are not remembered. Nevertheless, it was demonstrated many years ago, by the earlier psychologists, that, no matter how profound the sleep, dreams do not cease. It is precisely so in hypnotism. If the hypnosis is profound, the subject does not remember the experiences through which he has passed. It is, however, in that state of profound hypnosis that the most wonderful phenomena are produced. It is then that the evidences are most conclusive of a second intelligence existent in man, for it is then that the distinctive attributes and powers of the subjective entity come to the surface. This, then, is the broad dividing line which separates the two hypothetical entities. It is so plain and palpable that it cannot fail to be observed by everyone who has witnessed the phenomena of hypnotism, and it consists, as before remarked, in the fact that the essential condition precedent to the successful exercise of the distinctive attributes and powers of each of the two minds is that the other must be in a state of quiescence. This fact alone constitutes prima facie evidence of duality, at least in the limited sense of the term. It will now be in order to ascertain the distinctive characteristics which differentiate the objective and subjective mental states, with the view of determining whether they point logically to the conclusion that the phenomena are the product of two distinct mental organizations. The first distinctive characteristic of the subjective mind, which differentiates it from the objective in a most marked and unmistakable manner, consists in the fact that it is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion. This fact has been noted in a previous chapter and is restated here for the sake of a symmetrical grouping of the whole of the leading characteristics of the subjective entity. It need not be dwelt upon at this time further than to remark upon its universality. The scientists to whom the world is forever indebted for the discovery of the law of suggestion did not realize that it applied to other than the phenomena evoked by experimental hypnotism. Indeed, Bernheim himself expressly founds his definition of hypnotism upon the assumed fact that it only increases the susceptibility to suggestion. In other words, he assumes that all men are more or less susceptible to suggestion in their waking state. That this is true only in the limited sense that all men in their normal condition are more or less susceptible to persuasion or argument is demonstrated by every experiment legitimately conducted. It is true that a very slight degree of hypnosis is required in very sensitive subjects, or in those who have often been hypnotized by the operator, as was the case in Bernheim's experiments. But that some degree of subjectivity or abeyance of the objective faculties is required to render a person susceptible to the power of suggestion proper is all but self-evident. Thus it is a fact of common experience that when one goes to a dentist's office to have an aching tooth extracted, he invariably finds upon his arrival that the tooth has ceased to ache. In other words, nature has hypnotized him so far as to produce anesthesia in the refractory nerve, although he appears to be in a perfectly normal condition. If, now, someone who understands the power of suggestion and knows how to apply it should make the suggestion to the patient that the anesthesia would be continued until the tooth is extracted, no pain would be experienced from the operation. The points to be here observed are, first, that it requires but a slight degree of hypnosis to render one susceptible to the power of suggestion. Secondly, that some degree of abeyance of the objective faculties is necessary to render suggestion effective. Thirdly, that the law of suggestion is universal and applies to all degrees of subjectivity and to all psychic phenomena of whatever name or nature. And fourthly, that the subjective mind is controllable by suggestion against reason, experience, and the evidences of the senses. It is unnecessary to remark that the objective mind, in its normal state, is not susceptible to such control. It will not be denied that this difference between the two mental states of man possesses a veritable significance of some kind, nor can it be doubted that the solution of the problem will prove of the utmost importance to the human family. The second proposition bearing upon the subject is that the subjective mind is incapable of reasoning inductively. This will readily be seen to be a corollary of the law of suggestion. That is to say, under the law of suggestion, the subjective mind, when it reasons at all, necessarily takes its premises from the objective mind. In experimental hypnotism, its premises are the suggestions of the hypnotist. From those suggestions it will reason deductively with most marvelous acumen. Indeed, its power of correct deduction from any premises suggested seems to be practically perfect. And this is equally true whether the premises are true or false. Like the ancient Greek philosophers, it does not disdain facts when they will serve its purpose, that is, when they serve to sustain the proposition embraced in the suggestion. Indeed, it will marshal all such facts that are within the storehouse of its perfect memory, but it will persistently ignore all facts which militate against the suggestion. It is impossible that it should do otherwise. The inexorable law of suggestion interposes an insuperable barrier against independent thought, which is the very essence of induction. The subjective mind cannot marshal facts except on one side of a question, and that side is in favor of the suggestion which happens for the time being to be uppermost. That is as true of the subjective mental operations of everyday life as it is of experimental hypnotism. The third proposition is that the power of the subjective mind to reason deductively from given premises is practically perfect. This has been mentioned in the foregoing paragraphs, but it requires further elucidation. I do not set this down as a distinctive characteristic of the subjective mind which is antithetical to the objective, for it is obvious that the latter possesses that power. But it is worthy of note, for the reason that the difference in degree is so marked that it practically amounts to a distinctive attribute of the subjective mind. Nor do I assert that its power of correct deduction is perfect. It is manifestly impossible to know just when the conditions are perfect for the manifestation of the highest powers. But that under favorable conditions it is practically perfect does not admit of doubt in the minds of those who have intelligently observed the phenomena of experimental hypnotism, or, indeed, any of the higher phases of psychic phenomena. When this prodigious power of correct deduction is properly understood and appreciated, it will be found to furnish the key to many obscure problems in psychic science. As a single instance, I will mention the fact that many of the phenomena of so-called prevision or prophecy may be traced directly to the power of correct deduction from premises derived from any of the myriad sources from which a suggestion may be imparted or knowledge obtained. Telepathy, for instance, is one of the sources of information through which the subjective mind obtains knowledge of facts not consciously possessed by the objective intelligence of either of the parties concerned. It is safe to say that most, if not all, of the mysterious cases of prevision may be traced to this cause. I do not say that the subjective mind of man may not possess the inherent power of correct prevision independently of knowledge of the subject matter or the processes of reasoning. I do not know. Many stories are current which would seem to indicate the existence of that power. But such stories are usually very far from being sufficiently well authenticated to warrant any scientist in giving them anything more than a provisional place in psychic science. Certain it is that all the scientifically verified accounts of correct prevision may be traced directly to the soul's wonderful power of correct deduction, and all that is mysterious regarding its sources of information may be traced to telepathy and perfect memory. When these two powers are taken into consideration, it will readily be seen that the subjective mind is in possession of sources of data of which the objective intelligence of mankind has as yet but a faint conception. And when to these sources of information is added the power of perfect deduction, it will be seen that much, if not all, of that which has seemed mysterious and inexplicable except by reference to supramundane sources of information, is easily explained by reference to natural laws with which the world is fast becoming acquainted. May not this be the fountain of this pleasing hope, this fond desire, this longing after immortality? May it not be the origin of that emotion of the human mind which has been designated as an intuitive knowledge of a life to come? May not the soul have experiences of spiritual life so far removed from the physical realm that no cognizance of them can be taken by the objective consciousness? May not the soul be able to reach a state of consciousness so exalted as to enable it to come into contact and conscious communion with a deific intelligence and to imbibe truth from its eternal source? May not the soul reach such a state of illumination during the unconscious moments of the physical senses that all spiritual truth will be open to its intuitive perceptions? May not the soul, either in its state of induced exaltation or by the exercise of its normal powers, be able to take cognizance of spiritual facts from which it may, by the exercise of its marvelous powers of correct deduction, be able to demonstrate to its own consciousness the fact of immortality? All these questions, and more, will be asked by the earnest seeker after tangible evidences of a future life. They are interesting, if not pertinent, questions. And were we indulging in the pleasing fantasies of speculative philosophy and could thus afford to dispense with facts, we might construct an argument for immortality that to many would seem impregnable. But there is one insuperable obstacle in the way which must forever prevent the construction of a conclusive argument based upon these hypothetical powers. The inexorable law of suggestion interposes itself at the very threshold of the argument and casts a doubt upon the verity of the premises. It might even be demonstrated that the soul's power of correct deduction from given premises was perfect and infallible, yet, when the correctness of the premises is in doubt, the argument based upon them is necessarily invalid. In other words, the soul, so long as it inhabits the body, is never exempt from the operation of the law of suggestion. Hence, it is often impossible to know whether its supposed perceptions are veridical or are merely subjective hallucinations resulting from autosuggestion or from a suggestion imparted to it from some extraneous source. It is evident, therefore, that we must look elsewhere than in hypothetical perceptions or intuitions, unsupported by demonstrative evidence of their verity, for logical proof of a future life. I have dwelt thus far upon the subject of the deductive power of the subjective mind, not because it differentiates the one mind from the other, except in degree, but because of its general interest in that it furnishes an explanation of much of the phenomena of so-called prevision. In the ensuing chapter, one will return to the consideration of those faculties of the soul which present distinctive points of difference from the faculties and functions of the objective mind.